right, everybody, let's get started. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the SCCU Daily Planet Theater here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Come on in and grab a seat wherever you're at on the first, second, or third floors. You can join us for today's special presentation, which every Wednesday at noon is special because that's when we gather here at the museum and around the glow of our YouTube screens for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. That's a lecture program organized and coordinated by the folks in the Office of Environmental Education and Public Affairs within the Department of Environmental Quality. Their offices, headquarters are right next door to the museum, and it creates a great opportunity for us to work together to spread the good news about science, nature, technology, engineering, math, conservation, education, art, all kinds of great things, but as it pertains to science, nature, and the environment, and most often here in North Carolina. We have a great opportunity to do that. My name is Chris. I work here at the Museum in Education, and I'm your host every Wednesday for the program. My job is to just say, hi, welcome, thanks for being here, and then also to introduce our guest speakers. But after the presentation, after we've done lots of good listening and good learning with today's special guests, you will have the opportunity to ask your questions and share your insights as well. So whether you're here in the globe with me or watching online on YouTube, make sure that you've got your questions ready after the presentation to ask our very special guest. Now, you can see he's here on stage with me already. Everybody, this is Dr. Seth Hawkins. One, he's a medical professional, but he's got some cool credentials behind him too. Dr. Hawkins is the medical director for North Carolina State Parks and for the U.S. Forest Service in North Carolina, and is also a friend of the Office of Environmental Education and the museum. This is not Dr. Hawkins' first appearance with us here at the museum. I think you've done 2 other appearances at least, and they've been on all kinds of incredible topics. I think actually you could we could search for you on the museum's YouTube channel and pull up lots of great opportunities to learn different things. But I'm excited today because I just found out Dr. Hawkins just completed another degree program and just graduated. Congratulations, you did it. Fantastic stuff out at UNC Charlotte. So I'm excited to see what we've got to learn from you this time, and I'll turn it over to you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Hey, everyone. Hey to those in the audience here and those kind of zooming in remotely. This is actually the first time I've been in the Globe Theater. This is so cool. So if you aren't seeing this, if you're remotely, it's a actual globe and we're talking inside it, which is really great. Really appreciate you joining me today. We're going to cover some material quickly that I've been working on for the last 3 years. It's pretty fresh to me, as I'll explain to you. So I might be working a little bit more off notes than I would typically do. And yeah, just to round out my background and positionality a little bit more, I'm an emergency and EMS physician. I've worked for about a quarter century. About half of my work is in the emergency department, where I work for Wake Forest University as an associate professor and clinically at Catawba Valley Medical Center. And about half of my work is contracts with things like U.S. Forest Service, state parks that you serve as medical director. And just in an overabundance of enthusiasm, I decided to take a third full-time role over the last 3 years at UNC Charlotte, working on a dual degree in anthropology and public health, which resulted in this work you're seeing here. So this work is the capstone and thesis work I was doing from the anthropology side of things for that degree. And I went back to school because I realized what I was doing in medicine was really more or as much public health and anthropology as it was medicine, dealing with the care of the public in open spaces and population-based interventions, and I really needed more training in that area. Interestingly, about 15 to 25% of people graduating from UNC Chapel Hill right now, which is my medical school alma mater, get an MPH along with their, go Tar Heels, get an MPH along with their MD, speaking to the need, I think, for more understanding about public health and dealing with population-based interventions and equity. And certainly post-pandemic, that's been even more true. So I dove into this work and didn't know that I would be working on wildland fire topics, but the 3 years training kind of pulled me into this research. At the end, I hope you'll see how I think this is an exciting topic for us as invested citizens in North Carolina, and it's a great avenue for anthropology and public health as well as medicine. I should say, in this context, I am speaking here only as a speaker at the museum, not representing state parks, U.S. Forest Service, or really anything except my work as a student at UNC Charlotte. And this topic is obviously national, but my focus on it was exceptionally place-based. So we're going to be talking specifically about North Carolina, which I think makes a great topic for us here this afternoon. But just to recognize there's lots more of the story elsewhere, and this is really drilled down into North Carolina topics. So ultimately what I found doing this work, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the research process, was what I'm terming a paradox of the mainstream, which makes the point or the contention that really our mainstream fire practices are actually marginalized in our society, which is paradoxical, and I look forward to exploring that topic with you further today. Just for some definitions, because it's really important to be talking the same language. Wildland fires is the overall category of what we're talking about, of any non-structure fire that occurs either in vegetation or natural fuels, and this can include prescribed fires or wildfires. And prescribed fires is a newer phenomenon in the late 20th and 21st century of setting fires by prescription to try to take up timber and prevent more uncontrolled wildfires through a prescribed area that will be burned, in theory, to have less dangerous smoke and less impact on the surrounding environment, and certainly no impact on human lives or structures. But wildfires are the manifestation of fires that are not prescribed. They could be prescribed fires that have jumped their prescription, or ones that are just naturally caused by lightning or other sources, most often human. Actually, more than 95% of wildfires are human-caused, and these would not be controlled, and firefighters go in and try to control them. Cultural burning is another interesting phenomenon that we have representatives of here in the audience today. Great to see you. And that is new in the sense of the terminology of cultural burning, which became more acceptable, as we'll discuss recently. But it's an extension of indigenous burning, which has gone on really for centuries in North America. And this would be intentionally set fires that have land management principles, but also lots of cultural importance and principles baked into them, and we'll be getting into that today. The wildland-urban interface is an important concept to consider as well, which is the space between the wildland, or the spaces where we don't think about human habitation, and then human structures. And that protecting that margin and understanding what we're doing about structural firefighting or urban or suburban firefighting versus wildland firefighting, the separation between that is this WUI, or this wildland-urban interface. So my research question was looking first at what wildland firefighters felt were the health parameters of their work, how they felt their own medical care and safety was addressed, and what the public health concerns were that they saw in their work. And that, as we'll see, kind of merged into inquiry into cultural burning. So what I was doing was called inductive research. So deductive research, now that we're in the Science Museum, speaking about two kind of branches of scientific inquiry. A deductive research project would take a question, develop a hypothesis, and then test it. That's the classic sort of science that we often think about. But inductive research goes in, this is often an anthropological approach. We'll go into a community and we'll look for what question needs to be answered. So there will be semi-structured ways to attack that, but one is open during that research to see where research topics takes the investigator, and that was the approach that I took, which will kind of help explain why we ended up talking about cultural burning. And the reason this is important in North Carolina is, oh, my stars and garters, we have fires. So there's this sort of myth that wildfires happen out west, they're deep in the wilderness, they're not an eastern United States issue, but in fact, fully half of all wildfires occur in the southeast, really many very close to homes. And so you can see on the top left here, we only need to look to the Great Smoky Mountain fires of 2016, which enveloped Gatlinburg and killed 14 people and injured 190 to know here, right next to North Carolina and potentially in North Carolina, we have wildfires that can be dangerous for humans, but certainly we also have just a lot of fire. The South is one of the fastest growing areas in the United States, like you know, with North Carolina really huge among that. And what that's led to is, in fact, North Carolina is #1 in the country for number of acres designated as WUI, which you remember is that interface between urban and wilderness settings. So this really is something that we need to consider. On the map here at the bottom, there's a picture. This is probably about a month ago on Earth Day. This was the number of active fires that were going on in North Carolina. So you can see this is very prevalent. At that time, we had the Bee Rock Creek fire, which at that day on Earth Day was the #1 fire priority for the United States, with hundreds of firefighters coming to North Carolina to work that fire. That was about 40 miles from my house in Morganton, North Carolina. So many of us are very interested in this topic because it's actually quite close to us, even though we don't think about it. And that's one of the themes about the marginalization that I want to throw your way, is that we think about wildland fires as something else that happens to other people. But as we are evacuating major tourist areas in South Carolina or evacuating portions in western North Carolina for something that's not a 100-year hurricane, but is something that's coming around regularly, we have to accommodate the fact that this is actually a phenomenon that is pretty common in our area. So a little bit about positionality for me and some ethical considerations. I think it's important to say that I borrowed trust from the community and individuals that I worked with. So I am not a wildland firefighter. I'm not a structural firefighter. I have no native or indigenous heritage that I'm aware of. I'm not a cultural burner. So my understanding about science and the way science works and my role in it as an applied professional in medicine was that I was supposed to be the expert. So as a physician, people come to me in the emergency department and they present me with their problem, and I am providing expert consultation on what I think they should do, medically speaking. And it would be a little curious if I was like, I don't know, what do you think? But I kind of wonder if physicians maybe shouldn't do more of that, because we are so trained in the expert model that we sometimes forget how medical care is a collaboration. Anthropology is really, really good at that. So the science of anthropology is really good about positioning the people doing the research to not necessarily be the experts in it. So one of the mistakes that media sometimes does is they'll put up a story about Indonesia or something, and they'll put an anthropology professor out and they'll say, expert in Indonesia. And usually they try to do some correction to that, because their point is usually the Indonesians are the experts in Indonesia. As an anthropologist, you're sort of a bridge, and that's what over the last 3 years I really had to learn to do. Was here's this topic that interests me: healthcare, public health in wildland fire environments. I will never be the expert in this in 3 years. I won't be the expert probably in it my whole life, because the experts are the people who are living and doing this work. But it's important to be able to do research into that area, bridging those with expertise to get a broader audience. So it's important to know I am a student of these topics, and I will remain a student. I'm a very enthusiastic student, and hopefully some of the translational work I do lands for you, but I don't think I'm an expert in these topics. The second important thing is that I am medical director for state parks and LEMA, which is the federal term for medical director for U.S. forests in North Carolina. And those are contract jobs. At no time did I ever approach these roles as if I was in that position. I was always identifying myself as a student at UNC Charlotte. And in fact, in the sense I'm not an employee of the state or the federal government, either of those senses, as they are quick to point out, that contract work, I think, benefits really well from this perception. So this perspective of anthropology and public health. So in fact, I think it would be great if more of this were done, if physicians and medical directors kind of did ethnographic work with the people that they are collaborating with to explore these kind of topics. And third, my positionality, just presenting myself as an anthropologist, could be seen as problematic or challenging in this topic, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So just to quickly go through some historical phases of fire and wildland fire, and particularly human intervention in it in North America. This is maybe one of the key points I hope you go home with understanding, that there was wildland fire burning that was intentional by indigenous native communities in North America before the arrival of Europeans. This is often not well understood. Pine, not the tree, but the fire scholar, so with a Y, P-Y-N-E, characterizes this as Asian fire. And we think that before European arrival, humans came over the Bering Strait and obviously inhabited North America for millennia before the arrival of Europeans. And there is very, very good evidence that there was widespread use of intentional firing across North America for cultural and land management purposes before European arrival. And that started really with the Pleistocene all the way to the point where Spanish, or in this case of North Carolina, Spanish Europeans arrived on the coast. So when they arrived, they found a vast forest of longleaf pine dominated ecosystems, which is our state tree, right? It's go Tar Heels. It's the source, one of, the term Tar Heel. It's deeply ingrained in our understanding of being a North Carolinian. I just passed I don't know if any of you know this, the Longleaf Inn and, right? Longleaf Inn and Bar, Longleaf Inn and Hotel. Coming in here, longleaf pine is huge in our state. This was 40 million acres extending from the James River in Virginia all the way down to Florida, and then in mixed ecosystems where longleaf pine was contributory out to Texas. So when they arrived, this was the environment that they saw, which is only possible if there is human intervention on the environment to allow the longleaf pine to become a dominant species because it's fire dependent. So there's this myth that we often see in a romanticized narrative in a post-European arrival world that there was a pristine forest that existed without human intervention before Europeans arrived, when in fact, pre-colonially, there was a longer period of what I would say is land management or land interaction that involved intentional burning longer than we have been a country right now. So very important to understand that. And then in the era where Europeans arrived and immediately afterwards, we entered quickly into a fire suppression phase. So this is coinciding, it's definitely through the 19th century, and during that time, while initially colonial settlers and other Europeans were adopting some of these land management techniques because they were seen as effective, increasingly the science of the day said that there's all sorts of racist terminology around how inappropriate this was and non-scientific, and that burning trees for land management purposes was not the appropriate approach. But this became really militarized around the beginning of the 20th century with a couple things. The Big Burn in 1910, which was very seminal in Roosevelt's presidency, and Montana had multiple towns that burned down, and that was the very beginning of the U.S. Forest Service a few years before. So the Big Burn and watching huge acreage of communities in North America get burnt very much drove this idea that the U.S. Forest Service should be stopping fires altogether. And then in World War II, it became militarized. And interestingly, fun fact, I don't know if you knew this, the only civilians that were killed in the United States during World War II were killed by Japanese fire balloons in Oregon. So there was a very real military technique that the Japanese were considering of floating balloons into the United States and firing the woods as an intentional military operation. And so that got caught up in this idea of suppressing fires. And this is the beginning of the Smokey Bear era, which is, by some accounts, the most successful public health effort in the history of our country. There are two people that have their own zip codes. One is Smokey Bear, and one is Truman or somebody, a president. So if you think about how much people understand Smokey Bear and how much of an impact that has, which is the point of public health campaigns, you can recognize we have ingrained in our cultural understanding the idea that wildland fire is dangerous and bad and only you can prevent it, particularly wildfires. And the idea of prevention generates down to the individual level that we all need to be partners in preventing any fire from happening. And this became so ubiquitous as a policy that there was a 10 a.m. policy that was perpetuated throughout most of the 20th century that said any fire that was found in a wilderness area had to be put out by 10 a.m. the next morning. So this is the fire suppression phase. It went up to the 1980s. Smokey Bear still persists, but in the 1980s, we began realizing this might not be such a good idea because that's a lot of wood that normally would burn. And one of the authors I read that I really liked talked about conversations he had with, he's a deep ecologist, works at the Sierra Club, was talking about the sequoias. And somebody had reached out to him and said, I'm so sad the sequoias burned, this last summer. He's like, that was awesome. Sequoias are fire dependent. They needed that. And it was just radical like reconstruction of like, in the 80s, we realized there will be fire. There has to be fire. It's probably not a question of eradicating all fire. It's a question of how do we interface with that. And that's one of the big themes I want to share with you this afternoon is our question is probably not how do we eradicate wildfire, but how do we accommodate it into the work and the lives that we have. And so in the 80s and then very much into the 21st century, we began this third phase of thinking that there were opportunities to configure fire as good, and the hashtag for like the social media campaigns is hashtag good fire, and these would be prescribed fires. So the idea is now, and paradoxically, and this is a bit of the paradox of the mainstream, science now would say that if we go in and we burn areas that are particularly prone to fire intentionally and with specific goals and we can control it, we'll have less smoke exposure, less air quality problems, and less risk of human death or structural changes. And that kind of takes us up to today. Important to understand this history to what we'll be talking about this afternoon. And also maybe useful to know that one of the reasons that cultural burning, or the ability of native tribes to intentionally burn spaces for land management, but also for their own cultural practices, was able to become public again in the 21st century because there was this concept of good fire and that could be rolled into it. And in fact, many times the government enlists that now to say, look, this is a good idea, despite having really almost violently suppressed it for 100 years prior to that. Really quickly, not to like get deep into the weeds with anthropological literature, but two things I think are important. Jordan Thomas is out at UC Santa Barbara. He is phenomenal. He is an anthropologist, wildland firefighter. He has a book coming out that I haven't read because he won't give me an early copy of it, and it comes out this month. So I haven't seen it yet, but his argument is that wildland firefighters can form an embodied knowledge of the land and that actually have a huge amount of operational, pragmatic information about how to interface with these experiences and these states of wildland fire that we need to privilege and recognize. And really that sometimes, he doesn't explicitly, I think, do this, but that can also kind of point back a bit to indigenous experiences of having wildland fire that's not completely a negative interface. And Petrina does work on runaway change and horizoning in climate change. So it's really hard to separate this topic from climate change, and we probably shouldn't. And her contention specifically about wildland fire is that there's this runaway change phenomenon where we no longer have a wildfire season. It's all year. We no longer have the predictability of the kind of fires we were expecting because it's changed. So with this runaway change, with climate change, she thinks we need to do horizoning work to change the goals that we have and the structures around the context of the work that we do, which is really important. I think part of what we're talking about this afternoon is changing our paradigms to have different approaches in a climate changing world to wildland fire. And it's not necessarily what you might think. So quickly, just talking about individual and public health, the picture, many people here in this building work for the government. This picture here on the left is the cover page of a publication that has a ton of organizations, many of whom may not always work together, just to say that this is a topic that has widespread importance from the CDC to the EPA to all sorts of organizations. And they do put out statements about particularly wildfire smoke, which I think is an important topic for us as a community from a public health standpoint. And the message from the mainstream hegemonic governmental community would be that in general, wildfire smoke is safe except for certain populations if it is only episodic exposure and it is not combusting chemicals and things that might be in a more industrial setting. In particular, research out of NC State in 2016 with state parks suggested that, and this is what had been supposed, but there's now some evidence for it, that prescribed fires in particular will have less PM2.5 content or less particles that are dangerous, less chemicals, and will be less dangerous to communities immediately adjacent to the firing. This is what we would call in anthropology a thick concept, because there's a lot going on here, a lot of details to the science. The same year in 2016 that North Carolina State University put out this research suggesting that state park prescribed fire burning evidence would suggest that the fires are less severe from a public health standpoint, published a parallel article that said, it's really hard to know. there's a lot of elements to the methodology and to the connection between air pollution and health response that's complicated, that we don't know. This is a great thing that physicians love to do, is have a journal club and pick apart these articles and say, but look, this connection doesn't totally work with this. So for example, you can't just say how many asthmatic patients show up in an emergency department during a wildfire experience or not and have causality between the two. So it's hashtag, it's complicated, but I do think it's important that this research is being done, and I do think it's important to reassure that in general, the thinking is that wildfire smoke is not the most dangerous pollutant that we may have in our environment, although this is contested and there's recent publications coming out just in the last couple months that would challenge this, and certainly in a deep ecology perspective and from some of the counter hegemonic entities that are out there and community members that are out there, there is a narrative that in fact there's some positionality problem and bias in these studies, and that this is more dangerous than we might think. All this, for somebody like me, is like red meat. It's like this is what we need to dig into and really try to extract bias and get to a better understanding of what the truth is. And key to this is that, back to my original research question, wildland firefighters are rated the praxis of this question because they are out there in the smoke and the fire on a daily basis doing this work. This may be a little bit hard to see, but the punchline here about the state of health for wildland firefighters is it is dire. So wildland firefighters have the highest mortality rate of any federal employee. This includes military outside of wartime and law enforcement. So in 2022, their workplace was recategorized into the highest category for carcinogens. Bear in mind, they don't usually wear respirators or self-contained breathing apparatus like a structural firefighter. They have 43% higher risk for lung cancer, 30% higher risk for cardiovascular disease. The OSHA 8-hour acceptable smoke exposure level is exceeded about 5% of the time in their environment. So if we're worried about health, we are worried about public health for fires and smoke and the fact that fires in Canada can envelop the East Coast in smoke, but we should really be worried about what these men and women are doing in these spaces. And there's also, what is more of the attention here, interest in the mental health of wildland firefighters. And this is kind of a public safety, public service story about how dire these kind of numbers are. And as an educator and a physician, my interest is in how they get trained. And so I went to the primary textbook for wildland firefighting. So this book is 400 pages long. They dedicate 21 sentences of that to mental health resilience, stress injuries. Well, I don't even think they reference stress injuries. Their last sentence, the summation recommendation, is you must learn how to deal with your specific stress reaction tendencies. Figure it out. So I think part of the theme of this lunchtime lecture series is resilience. Resilience is a very, post-pandemic especially, is a very loaded word for healthcare professionals, including myself. There is a tendency when we discuss resilience to talk about the ways people can be stronger in the face of adversity, even if that adversity is systemic violence, slow violence, inappropriate staffing, inappropriate work environments, inappropriate equipment. So I think we can do more. I think we can do more than that sentence as we talk about healthcare for wildland firefighters. So it's a little bit of background for what I came in to do, and this is my own personal research over the last 2 years. So methodologically, I interviewed wildland firefighters with the U.S. Forest Service, North Carolina State Parks. I did subsequent interviews and with individuals who were parallel to and adjacent to that world. And then I used what's called snowballing approaches to recruiting additional interviewees to talk to this topic about based on where that information was taking me. It was all IRB, or Institutional Review Board, approved. For those of you that are scientists and interested, we could talk about this afterwards if you'd like to talk further about it. I had to get state, federal, tribal, IRB approval, and approvals from North Carolina State Parks and U.S. Forest Service, which is an astonishing amount of work. So just to say there's stuff there as well to discuss if you're interested. So initially, I was doing interviews and site visits. I was going to do actually like participant observation on the fire line, and this was excluded by my IRB team. We'll be discussing that a bit later in my talk. And then I used InVivo, which is a coding software to analyze for themes. So this is the results of what I ended up doing over the last year. It was a total of 13 interviews. Those of you who are scientists will be like, wow, that is a low N. And that is true. So one feature about anthropology research is it looks for thick representations and it looks for themes. And so once you get saturation in a theme, you feel like you can kind of move on. And often it's based on smaller populations and smaller samples of populations. But this also talks a little bit about the gender differences and who I was talking to who are wildland firefighters and who were cultural burners, which I'll get into a bit in how we ended up in that space. And these were all about an hour. Some were more like a half day. And many people represented multiple categories. So I might have talked to scientists who were wildland firefighters or vice versa, or other combinations. So a little bit about the results of what I was hearing from wildland firefighters. A lot of wildland firefighters were speaking to the intersectional nature of their work in public health and the human role that they played despite working in a space that's often thought of as wilderness or not human. And one of the interesting epistemological and terminology kind of concepts is whether wilderness areas, I mean formal U.S. Forest Service wilderness areas or national forests or state parks are human spaces or wilderness spaces. But with the perception that they are not working in the city or working in structural firefighting, there was still a big public health role in what they did. I'm not sure how well, yeah, that should come across okay. And so, you know, part of the idea is you're out there, you're working like deep in the wilderness, and I mean not just the perception, but you are kind of like out in the wilderness, and what you're doing is protecting Las Vegas's electrical supply. So there is this sense that what they're doing is connected to a human community and not just simply, you know, wilderness work. The second quote, which is really poignant, was from a retired firefighter, and sometimes they'll be doing structural work. And we saw this right in LA, like not so long ago, where they were actually protecting people's homes. And that obviously really brings home the idea that you're working to protect human health. And in that particular case, they lost like 650 homes, but it still stuck with him, that feeling of that's right where he wanted to be. And for those of you who work in public safety, public health, emergency medicine, emergency services, it's understandable. This is what pulls us into this kind of work. In terms of their own health, just really important for us to recognize what kind of operational environment they are in. So talking about the shroud, just to give you a picture, the top right shows a shroud, a firefighter, a structural firefighter with what would be behind him would be the SCBA or the big tank that would have oxygen and a respirator to filter air. Dude on the other side, I'm a little confused about left and right, dude on your left is more of the wildland firefighter, you know, approach. So like big chainsaw, backpack with gear he needs for the day, sunglasses, no respirator. So really different operational environments, and part of what's phenomenal and amazing about this kind of work is the caloric and physical task of doing work in that space with those kind of resources and amount of weight that you would be carrying. And what really struck home to me was one of the things I think that's unanswered in this that would be important for us to consider, and there's a lot of sort of dialogue about this, is should wildland firefighters have respirators? Should they be wearing N95 masks or something more formal? Should they have more protective gear? And while I would table that and say that's something that we need to discuss, and that is partly cultural in the sense that many times they themselves would be declining that intervention, I love this quote: "We don't need respirators. We want health insurance and adequate health care." So this is, again, a bit of the paradox of the mainstream. They just need mainstream support. If they are so important to us and what we think that they do is so valorized, we at least need to make sure that they have pensions and health insurance, and we know if they have a high risk of developing cancer down the road from their 4 years as a seasonal worker, what does that mean for their health coverage? And that's interesting that that's kind of more of what's on the forefront of their mind. It's just being treated like other standard employees with a living wage that matches the environment they need to work in. Many times wildland firefighters can't afford to live in the housing, in the spaces that they're deployed. So wildland firefighters made $13 an hour starting until August of 2021. I can't see people online, but I got some open mouths, like, and not to diminish any other employee in the world, because they're all, one thing firefighter and king syndrome taught us from COVID is that there is no unessential worker, but you can get a job at Walmart stocking, shelves and do better than that. So it was increased in temporarily to $15 an hour, and then permanently in March, you may have heard, to $15 an hour. And there is a bucket load of like additional overtime and things that you can get. But that shouldn't be the necessity, would be to work what's considered excessive, beyond your baseline to get what would be considered a kind of a basic payment for this sort of work. So, and the third quote is kind of the big pivot point for me, where what I kept hearing about was curiosity about what happened before this whole system was set up, where there were wildland firefighters and it was militarized and there was a U.S. Forest Service and Europeans came in and set this different land management strategy. Like, there were people around, and they keep hearing those people were doing stuff with the trees that involve fire. But what I kept hearing, and I actually heard it at the conference that I went to for prescribed burning in Western North Carolina. A gentleman from the podium said this. He said, "How could we ever know?" And I heard this in interviews again and again. It's deep history. How could we ever know what had happened in those times? And I was like, I think that's what anthropologists do. Not sure, but I'm just checking it out. I think that's actually something we can figure out. So midway through the research, I was like, this is great. I'm learning all about like these health issues with wildland firefighters and the public health considerations about this. I'm getting this sense that, like, paradoxically, we're not really maybe doing either what we could be doing right now to do it the best we are, or isn't it weird that for 100 years we like had this, you may not know this, but like Bambi was originally like a story from the Netherlands where it was poachers that killed Bambi. And this is Walt Disney in peri-World War II era, like, 1950s or late 1940s? And Bambi was run out of the woods and her parents were killed by a wildland fire. Like, we wrote this into the cultural narrative that we grew up with. So we were raised with this idea that wildland fire is the enemy. Bambi. And I was like, maybe something could be different. But what I kept hearing as saturation was, there's controversy about whether we should be using respirators in the field, or what wildland firefighters really wanted out of their work, why they went into it, how seasonal is it. All that was very complicated. What was not complicated was people wanted to know more about what was happening before Spanish arrival in North Carolina in the colonial era. And so I sought out scientists, because I thought, this is something we actually do, and people probably just don't know it. So I approached all of the scientists I was speaking with as ethnographic subjects, which was important because they were kind of saying, so here's what I know from pyrodendrochronology, like looking at trees that were burnt years ago or even centuries ago. Here's what soil studies can tell us. But this is one pathway to knowledge. And it was interesting that they're all like, this is one story, but there's other narratives about what happened. And there's oral history around here. They're like, there are still Native Americans around. Like, it's not like they are a disappeared cultural phenomenon in our society. So we can tell you what science would say about like carbon dating for things, or what kind of fires were caused or occurred in certain times, of what maybe their source was, which is really cool. And a lot of really great work is being done. I don't know if it comes out well, this digitizing and georeferencing from South America, but there's really cool work being done that's partly social justice, partly just direct land management science about what we can learn about these spaces. For me, what became very interesting was the experience with the Lumbee Indian tribe in eastern North Carolina. So at the tail end of my work, I turned my attention there because they and precursors to the Lumbee tribe had been indigenously burning the land all the way back to before we could get oral or historical records. So this has been a tradition in that community long, long, long before European arrival, and there are still people there practicing in this way. So I connected with the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina and learned that a cultural burning association had formed just like a year before I started doing some of this investigation, which has one of the favorite logos I've ever seen. I love this logo. It's like jam-packed with symbolism, every element in it has like a deep iconographic meaning for the Lumbee and for the Lumbee connection to fire. But the bottom two pictures are really what I was interested in trying to explore, this idea that the indigenous burning that you can kind of see on the left that we're using as a representation of what was maybe done before European arrival was perpetuated to some degree in cultural burning that was occurring in this picture there on the right. And I should say these pictures are all from Instagram and sort of publicly available unless I took them. And I think the really key element to this is that this work that they were doing perpetuated through the 20th century despite this effort to suppress fire. And this speaks a little bit to the positionality of the Lumbee tribe. Again, not Lumbee. This is a story that I am sharing and am humbled to know that I may not get it right. The basic premise is that there was enough accommodation on the part of Lumbee Indians, maybe in counter-distinction to like the Cherokee, where they adopted more European practices early on, and therefore, in some ways, were able to continue other practices a little bit more surreptitiously and with a little bit less attention. That has mixed benefits. So the county that the Lumbee are primarily based in, from a public health standpoint, has challenges, and not being on the radar can have issues in sort of the modern world. But one thing it does maybe let you do is continue some of the cultural practices you had before and live on the same land that you lived on previously. And that was what was interesting me about this topic, was the possibility that this could be an insight into what the Lumbee were doing, what had happened before European arrival, and potentially even ways that we might change what we're doing now. So this slide shows a cultural burn on the left at the Lumbee Cultural Center, which is a multi-acre complex that's now the center of Lumbee practices, and it's now 95% burned. Much of it is burned, the vast majority of the space intentionally in this cultural burning practice. And I think you can see here how this is really different than like the picture of like the Great Smoky Mountains fire that enveloped Gatlinburg. You have this like mosaic of fire that is doesn't maybe pop here quite as well, but is underneath the framework of these pines that are dependent on it. It's like pools of fire, really different in terms of heat, in terms of intent, in terms of duration, and I think that's important. So the Lumbee are self-defined as the people of the dark water, which is the Lumbee River, is kind of characterized as the dark water. And so people I talked to were very evocative in their description about how you actually couldn't reach that water without burning the land. Like the cultural burning. So when I say land management, it wasn't just simply to the things we talk about, like prevent bad smoke or to cut down on amount of timber that might be catastrophic if there was a lightning fire, but literally the things that you would do culturally in the Lumbee tradition that required access to the dark water that was eponymic for them was accessed by culturally burning the spaces to get to them. And so what the words that they used to me were, you can't put fire in a box. And I think this speaks to a really important concept that was kind of eye-opening for me about this whole dialogue. I know we have at least one representative of sort of the water side of things in North Carolina Forest Service, and it got me thinking. We are very interested in our cultural framework in separating out what classically the Greeks would call elements. So, you know, fire is not an element, right? Like water is not, water's a compound, fire is a state. But we think about fire, water, air, earth, like, you know, those are like, what's the cartoon, the Airbender? Like, it's really deep in our society to think about, like, these are separate things. And, you know, in Airbender world, like, they live in separate communities. And so as I was talking to people in the Lumbee tribe, they're like, yeah, this is all a whole. And these are just manifestations of one whole. The water is part of what we need and what we have to access. And it's sort of the eponymic name for our people. But the fire is the way we get there. And you don't separate them. You don't put fire in a box. It's just another part of that overall experience. So it got me to thinking, we just had this huge allegedly, so one of the things also the anthropologists would promote is there's no such thing as a natural disaster, and that disasters are intrinsically human defined because we think of things as disasters are not based on our own agenda. But we just had this big event in Western North Carolina that was a ton, shit ton is the technical word, so that's actually larger than a ton, of water, like historic, like more water than we have ever recorded in spaces, and it was a water emergency. But we don't hate water. We feel like water is intrinsic to our lives. We can't survive more than a couple days without water. It's part of many of us who are in a Christian or Judeo-Christian religious heritage, part of like religious ceremonies. So we have a much more complicated vision of water that has very beneficial elements. And by the way, in North Carolina state parks, every year, drowning is the leading cause or one of the top 3 leading causes of death. Water kills us, water sustains us. It's with fire that we're different, where we're like, well, maybe there's good fire. We'll let a little bit of fire be good fire. But that's this like binary good fire, bad fire, which kind of collapses the complexity of like combustion engines. And it will only take you a few moments to think about how many times fire and combustion was part of your day today. We don't really think about that. So me going and spending time in the Lumbee community made me feel like there was much more complexity to this topic than I had really understood, and that I was a part of a society that just put fire in a box. And another one of the quotes that I really liked was, "There is a different way." And I think that's one of my biggest messages to you here, is that learning about people who perform cultural burning and who look at fire in a more complex way based on a heritage that's not from Disney, Japanese fire bombs, and a militarized U.S. Forest Service based on the big burn of 1910, but recognizing that fire will always be there, gave some pathways to learn more about how we might do it differently. So the middle picture here is the Lumbee River. This is my own, I think my only own picture. So you can see like the dark water. It's really, all this, so is my experience there was really powerful, and I could really see like, yes, I get the water, I get the importance, but I can also see how accessing it through underbrush would be almost impossible without this mosaic of cultural burning that you have, these little pools of fire. And then really importantly, in the other picture here, there's kids. So this is the case, that in cultural burning, including the family, including children, is considered to be not only appropriate, but it would be considered disrespectful to disallow that. And I confirmed that with West Coast interviews I did, that this is not unusual for cultural burning. So just want to like paint the picture. Me, physician, EMS physician, getting red carded, it was too dangerous for me to do research on a fire line because I might be killed, because fires are scary and bad. But you can bring children in this tradition to a different manifestation of it, but it speaks to this like completely different conception of what fire is. I want to spin through some last things really quickly because I do want to make sure that we have time for some questions, but here's some quick quotes that are reinforcing what I was saying. Actually, there were multiple times from multiple different people that this is something that was sort of saturation, the idea that the fire is in our bones. And this fired up all sorts of anthropologists' interest in my peers, because they were talking about like people who talked about fish in their bones, and it turned out there was like salmon, and this is like maybe even more meaningful than just metaphorical, but it is intrinsic biologically, genetically, culturally to this community. And I think it's important, again, to hit this quote of losing fire sovereignty leads to losing food sovereignty, leads to losing health. One of the really cool things that they are doing in this cultural center is getting legacy heritage seeds from eras before the current era, that they can now plant and grow legacy seeds from the tribe in culturally burnt, fire-dependent areas that would not be possible without that. And that has obviously huge implications for health, which we only need to look at the health metrics for Robeson County to understand. One of the last things I want to say, and I just really important, I want to get this across. This is that third point about why my positionality as an anthropologist could be problematic. This is an amazing book that was published in 2002, but written in the 1950s, and it never came up on my literature review as an intrepid anthropology graduate student among me or my mentors and professors. It languished in Florida in tall timbers, research center for about 30 years, because in the 1950s, the idea that Native Americans burnt wild infrastructure, burnt trees, was considered untenable. The author of this, whose name is Stewart with a T, was challenged by Stewart with a D, who some of you who know anthropology may know. Julian Stewart ran the Smithsonian Museum for many years. He was a very powerful anthropologist in the mid-20th century. And in a number of court cases in California, advanced a governmental argument that Native Americans were incapable of managing land because they had basically a savage culture that just accepted the environment as it was, and so couldn't be allowed to manage their own land in California because their heritage was just this savage tradition of like, we live in the woods, we don't know anything about managing them or how to use scientific applications to them. Stewart with a T, who wrote this book, lined up against this much more famous guy who was originally his professor and won every single court case in this series by pointing to wildland fire practices and fire management practices of Native Americans pre-colonially, our topic. This book is vastly definitive about how this was done across the country. This was seminal and instrumental in Native American rights to be able to manage their own land, and Wildland Fire was a story behind it, but was not published until his death. He died in 1993, and he submitted it for publication 6 months before he died, and it was turned down. It is an amazing book, and if you're interested in anything about this topic, the introduction, one of which is an ecologist and one of which is an anthropologist, is a searing indictment of what science did in the 20th century, and particularly what anthropologists did. So I would say I learned about this book from a member of the Lumbee Indian tribe. And how embarrassing is that? And how telling is that we think maybe in modern eras about Native American communities still as this fossilized community that's not integrated into the modern society, if we think about it at all. They read books better than I do. And they gave me this book, which is amazing, but the story there I think is important for us to reinvent anthropology. So what that is, to kind of wrap up, is called in the social sciences the application of traditional ecological knowledge into modern practices. This can be problematic, it can be tokenism, it can be exploitative, it can be really important. And I was talking to a member of the Lumbee Indian tribe who's also an archaeologist, and he had this quote which I thought was really important. There's risk both ways, but we need to start accessing the information that's out there. It is emblematic that this book was not published for a half century. That kind of suppression is just as bad as exclusive suppression of fire, and we need to start exploring this. So the paradox of the mainstream that I'm proposing to you, and I hope you've sort of sensed through this talk, is that we sometimes think about wildland firefighters as special forces of the fire service. We valorize them. The LA fires had all sorts of great elevation of wildland firefighters, but we also don't give them health insurance. We pay them $15 an hour. They are marginalized, which is paradoxical. Paradoxically, those practices and management systems are using or referring to indigenous practices that they themselves suppressed for 100 years. But if we are interested in prescribed burning, that tradition of indigenous firing does exist in transformed form, like so many things in the modern world, into cultural burning, and we can use that experience to inform what we do. This is a little bit of Petrina's horizoning or resetting context. A really marginalized part of our discussion about wildland fire management is just house defensibility. How many of you knew, not me, before this research of mine started, that you can actually make houses more resilient to wildfire? And this, I think, in the lunchtime series, being a little bit themed around resilience, this is something that we can talk about. What it requires is this maybe a little bit more Lumbee conception that fire is part of our environment like water is. If we're thinking about flood insurance and we're thinking about how to make houses more flood resilient, we should be doing the same thing for fire. So where do we go with this? I think we need to have wages that are, and this is the public health part, this is the advocacy part. Wildland firefighters need to be paid and have benefits that are commensurate with the hazards they take on, the work that they do. We need more research and into what actually the risks are, and then we need to equip them with the equipment that they need to do that. I think the public health messaging that we do around wildland fire should be risk communication informed, which is this public health concept that it should not be catastrophizing or exploitative. It should actually address the real risks of what we're doing, and it should be based on evidence. This is not that. So this is where the climate change story is a little bit more complicated than we let on. This is the journal for the cardiologists, the heart doctors in the United States, from April, I believe. This is the cover, a new threat to cardiovascular health, not true, right? Like, fire's been around since the earth has been around, and lumping together fire with these other elements and saying that this is exclusively a manifestation of climate change is hugely problematic. So what a lot of the deep ecologists that I was reading, and like this is a little bit of like the Sierra Club position, is that talking about wildland fire as destroying, annihilating, lots of other adjectives that can be really, really bad destructive force on forests is probably not the case. The biomass destruction in forests from wildfire is actually usually, unless there are extreme conditions like climate change, is not destructive, it's restorative. And what comes from it is restorative. And this was very, very clear and wonderfully quoted in my interviews with Lumbee Indians, who said that it's a cycle and this produces material that then we can reclaim. That's the opposite of destruction. So I think we need to go away from that kind of catastrophic language around wildland fires. And then ultimately, in terms of like making things more resilient, there's a little QR code that I built here. This is an awesome North Carolina Forest Service reference for ways that you can make your house more resilient. I spent a really great day at one of the teaching forests in the eastern part of the state, Turnbull, learning how, like they have a model house there and learning how to make a house more fire resistant. And it's really straightforward stuff. It's like you don't have dog doors, you don't have things in your gutters, you've got shingles that are fire resistant, you have vents that will prevent embers from floating in. These are not high expense or big things. And in the La Tuna fire in Los Angeles, before our big LA fires, it was amazing that houses that were ruggedized stood when others around it went down. So appreciate your time. I think the compulsion that I got when I asked people in the Lumbee tribe what I could do to kind of move this dialogue forward, knowing that anthropology is really about narratives and about stories and about the lived experience of human beings, and the message I got was tell the story, so here I am. One of the members is in the audience, so my first question afterwards to them will be, how much did I get it right and how much did I not, which is the student part and the revision part. But I think this is part of what we need to keep doing, is revisiting what wildfire means in our society. And the thing I want to get to you, I hope today, is it is more complicated than good fire, bad fire. It's much more complicated than 20th century Smokey Bear. And probably there's other communities we can look to get more sophistication. So that's my presentation for the day, and this is the Bee Rock Creek fire. So at the time of this picture, 180 personnel were assigned to the fire and evacuation orders were issued for McDowell County. So this is a pressing issue for us all, and based on the 20th century experience, we have to do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow, amazing, incredible stuff. Great job. What incredible work you've pulled together here, and amazing stories. We've got just a few minutes for questions, so if you're here in the globe with me, got something you want to know more about, just wave at me. I'll actually bring you a microphone, that way everybody in the room can hear. If you're watching online, you can post your questions in the chat on YouTube. I've got that pulled up here with me so that I can get your thoughts and questions into the program as well. I think the first thing that came to mind early in the presentation for me was, Seth, you went through like this long list of things you've been involved in and organizations you're involved in, but what was the pull into fire from what you're saying? Was it just wildland firefighters getting sick?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it was even, I mean, to the degree that this is marginalized, it was really from my roles in that world. It wasn't intellectual interest, but one thing I should say is I also was or had become the medical director for 5 wildland fire medical support teams. None of them during the time of this research deployed to North Carolina, so again, there wasn't a conflict there, but much of my work ends up being providing medical oversight and medical collaboration for teams that work medically in this space. Again, not having been a wildland firefighter myself, I had work to do to learn about that. However, again, in the medical world, I can't lean on that student categorization. So if somebody calls me and says, how are we going to deal with this situation? I can't say, hold on, I'm a student, let me look it up. There's expected to be a certain amount of expertise there. So learning about that environment and learning about the health challenges and the work is what pulled me into it initially. And what I thought, and I think has really proven to be true, was that an anthropological lens was very effective for that. So coming in initially from a public health standpoint and from a physician standpoint, utilizing the tools of anthropology to get a more inquisitive approach to it proved to be very helpful, which is maybe an underlying message here that I feel strongly about, is that we should be using much more social science resources in our medical systems, particularly in public health and in direct medical care, in examination rooms between patients and practitioners. So it was originally actually needing to work in the area. It was pragmatic and needing to have more information.
And I guess I'm struck by, you mentioned going through the 400-page textbook on firefighting and fire management, but then there's very little about, say, stress management, mental health management, things like that. And then that sort of seems to have led you down this very long and deep path of understanding fire through millennia. Can you share a little bit more about what brought you to that path from just needing to have medical guidelines for firefighters?
Boy, a couple of directions there. One is this concept of progress, quote unquote, that anthropologists are skeptical about. There's change. And I think one thing that we know in our modern society, especially post-pandemic, is there's a epidemic now of challenges to mental health, and particularly stress injuries, depression, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts. So this is something that we're obviously not getting exactly right now. And so I think many of us who work in the space are curious about how we can better do that kind of work. And one of it is just recognize it, calling it out and talking about stress injuries and their ubiquity in the kind of work we do. So that's something that I and colleagues are doing, is just trying to get more attention to the mental health parameters of this kind of work, because we have to. Physicians also have one of the highest suicide rates of white-collar workers in the country. And I think if you come from that position, the mental health is important. One of the things you inevitably butt up against right away is this is a culturally driven risk. So one of the things we learned during the pandemic, and there's some really interesting quotes from White House and federal governmental workers about how we managed the pandemic, is that we didn't recognize the risk of isolating people. And I think that's one of the things that we learned, is that human beings are not built to stay in their homes. I thought it'd be great. All of us there, I was like, I can get in better shape than I've ever been. I'm gonna read all my books. And like a couple weeks into it, you're like, man, this is actually kind of rough. That's cultural. So I think what interested me about this millennial approach, and interested the people I was interviewing, importantly from an inductive standpoint, is there were other eras where things were done differently. And what can we pull from those eras to make us more resilient, mitigate some of those things we're seeing as challenges. So to bring it full circle, I think what people were saying about, in these interviews where they were saying, I think things were different in a pre-colonial era, I think what they were saying was, what can we learn from that? Because clearly we're misfiring sometimes here. So that's what kind of brought me around, was to think, it was really a very amazing experience being in this Lumbee Cultural Center, in this Lumbee community, and being given the idea that things can be different. And that's the cultural side, is if we create a different conception about what this work is as a wildland firefighter, a different culture around their reimbursement, their practices, and the risks to them, that's where we can start attacking some of that mental health component, because we can rewrite the story for them in ways that don't say, you will need to learn how to deal with these stressors based on your own weaknesses, which is a little bit like the classic teaching we have for stress injuries, is they're like any other injury, but we don't say when you fall downstairs and you break your arm, why was your arm weak? Like, what is it about? Like, should you be walking stairs? Because your arm seems to be weaker than most people's. We fix the bone. So in the same way, we shouldn't be so interested in like, why was it that this stress injury was particularly problematic for you, as to change the structure around it to recognize that this is ubiquitous risk to everyone, and how can our culture be better at building spaces that are safer? And that's, I think, where it went millennial, because we could find cultural burning and these practices that were adhering to older models.
Incredible stuff. Last one for you from the chat. Can you recommend any journals or organizations to follow on social media or other places to learn more about this topic?
Yeah, that's the tell the story even more so, right? And a couple different directions with that. There is an active cultural burning movement in the United States, and there's a national conference, and there is a vibrant dialogue about that, and that is all searchable and acquirable. There's also really good research being done around wildland firefighting and health parameters in general, and I would say NC State. So I went to school at UNC Chapel Hill, currently a professor at Wake Forest. So apparently I'm not, this pains me to say, North Carolina State is actually doing some of the most exciting work right now, and they have a lab that's working on wildland firefighting and health parameters of it. So their work and looking at that, that community of scholars, I think is really helpful. And then honestly, I've been kind of blown away by the social media platform that North Carolina Forest Service and U.S. Forest Service have built. So if you simply want to see about the burns that are happening that are wildfires and are not intentional or planned prescribed burning, certainly on Facebook and I believe also on other social media platforms, both of those state and national organizations are doing a really good job about sharing information, which I think is part, from what I was getting from some more counter-hegemonic communities in North Carolina that were concerned about the risks of prescribed burns or about fires. Really what a lot of people crave is just information. They just want to know, when's there going to be a fire nearby? Here's smoke. What's it from? Am I at risk? What should I know about it? And that's actually been really, really well managed, I think, on social media. There's some effort and interest in having more of a public health element to that, which I think could be done, and being sort of balanced about risk, but just notification and information is all on social media from those state and federal agencies.
Let's give Dr. Hawkins one more round of applause.
Thank you all.
And you can drop your appreciations in the chat on YouTube as well. Folks, thanks for coming out today. Thanks for participating in the program. I know you learned something new and interesting, because I certainly did. And so I hope you'll come back again.
Oh, I'm really blowing you up.
And so I hope you'll come back and participate in our program again. Remember, if you want to come back to this program and want to share it with others, it's going to be archived on the museum's YouTube channel. You can see us after the show if you want to make sure you get the link in your inbox. And you can head to the Office of Environmental Education's website for that information as well, eenorthcarolina.org. There you can also sign up for the email newsletter to get the link to this and other programs like this one in your inbox every single week. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for tuning in. Everybody, be kind out there. We'll see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you.